Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 14th Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy. My name is Hillel Neuer, and I'm the Executive Director of United Nations Watch. On behalf of the 25 NGO co-sponsors of the Geneva Summit and the co-sponsor of this event today, the Permanent Mission of Canada, it is my honor to welcome you to this annual gathering from around the world of human rights dissidents, pro-democracy activists, former political prisoners, and family members and representatives of current political prisoners. I want to begin by thanking our partners, a cross-regional coalition of human rights organizations, for helping us to organize this summit and to assemble courageous champions of human rights and democracy. We meet in the building of the United Nations Human Rights Council in order to shine a global spotlight on some of the most urgent situations and to place critical issues on the world agenda. I have to say it's really a pleasure to see everyone here. It's been 2 years since the pandemic began that we weren't able to meet in person. The last time we did this a year ago, it was online, and we had a very vigorous debate internally whether we would do this event online or not, and we had to decide months ago, and we took the risk, and I'm really glad to see the incredible people that I began to meet with last night. They give us great strength, courage, and inspiration, so it's really a pleasure to see all of you. I do want to thank the Permanent Mission of Canada, which for many years has been a legacy supporter of the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and supporting the causes of courageous human rights defenders. It means a lot, and we've always had a strong Canadian element. One of the pillars of our event is Professor Irwin Cotler, the chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, the former Justice Minister of Canada and the iconic human rights lawyer for the oppressed. He couldn't make it today, but he sends his best wishes, and he's represented, I'm glad, by his colleagues Brandon and Yona. He's always been and remains a key part of our event. So thank you all of you for being here today. I would like at this time to give the floor over to Tamara Mohini, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Canada to the United Nations in Geneva. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for us today to co-sponsor the opening of the 14th Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy. This has always been an important civil society forum to inform and enhance the discussions and work that we all strive for together here at the United Nations to promote and protect human rights. And certainly we feel very strongly that by bringing together human rights defenders, activists, former political prisoners, and victims of human rights abuses, this platform helps their voices to be heard. And certainly as Canadian representatives, we strive to put the promotion of democracy, human rights, gender equality, and the rule of law at the core of our foreign policy priorities. And we feel that our work is very much enhanced by our strong partnerships with civil society and with many of the individuals here today. And with the ongoing level of threats to the rights of freedom of peaceful assembly, of association, freedom of expression and opinion in many countries, and I would be remiss if I did not refer to the current context of an illegal aggression against Ukraine and the strong evidence of human rights violations that is emerging. And we, in this context, we must ensure that we all contribute positively to anchoring global cooperation and multilateralism in a feminist and a human rights-based approach. So our participation in the Geneva Summit is, we hope, complemented by our ongoing efforts to promote and protect civil society, including by chairing the Community of Democracies Working Group on Enabling and Protecting Civil Society, and through the Freedom Online Coalition and the Media Freedom Coalition, both of which we play an important role at this time. So. We look forward very much to hearing from the human rights defenders who are able to join us today. We have great respect for your work to promote universal human rights on behalf of all those vulnerable groups, and your work is very important. And thank you, too, to the coalition of 25 non-governmental human rights groups from around the world and those representing them here for organizing this important summit. So we wish you a very productive summit and all the best for your deliberations.
Thank you. Before moving to our list of speakers, our distinguished list of speakers, I want to join the Canadian Deputy Permanent Representative in expressing our deep concern about what is happening in Ukraine and the aggression there. It's something we've been speaking about quite a bit in the past several weeks here at the United Nations Human Rights Council upstairs. And we will hear towards the end of our program from a refugee from Ukraine. And I would say that it's a singular moment for human rights defenders to be here in the building of the Human Rights Council. It's only the second time in history of the Human Rights Council that there will be an attempt this week to suspend the membership of one of the members. And I think I join in the statements that were made yesterday by the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, who said that the presence of Russia on the Human Rights Council is a farce, and it serves as a propaganda tool for them to pretend that they have a concern for human rights when the opposite is the case. And that's a case that we've made consistently here. And indeed, when we brought Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was twice poisoned and went into a coma, one of the most renowned dissidents, and he urged the United Nations not to elect Russia. And sadly, they were elected with 82% of the votes of the General Assembly. And this week, I do believe the resolution will pass. I urge all countries to support that resolution. I believe it will pass with a very strong majority. And I believe it's an important moment when the United Nations can reaffirm the founding principles of the Human Rights Council, which are to promote and protect human rights. The members are obliged to uphold the highest standards of human rights, and those who commit gross and systematic abuses under Article 8 of Resolution 60/251 can be suspended from the Council. And that principle has perhaps been neglected over the years, but this week it's being reaffirmed. And I know that for many of the people here, human rights defenders, that principle is important regarding Russia and other countries that may have certain positions. I'm just going to go quickly through the program. We're going to hear in a moment from our opening speaker, Nazanin Boniadi, on Iran. We're going to hear from Zarifa Ghafari, who was Afghanistan's youngest female mayor and survived 6 assassination attempts. We're going to hear from Leonid Volkov, the Russian opposition activist, chief of staff to Alexei Navalny. We're going to hear from Berta Valle, wife of imprisoned Nicaraguan opposition leader Felix Maradiaga, who spoke for us here just a few years ago, and now he's in prison. We'll hear from Hopewell Shinono, a Zimbabwean investigative journalist, former political prisoner, from Arij Al-Sadhan, activist, sister of Saudi political prisoner Abdul Rahman Al-Sadhan. We'll hear from Bobby Wine, Ugandan opposition leader and former political prisoner. We'll hear from Enes Kanter Freedom, NBA basketball player and human rights activist. And we'll hear from Olga Ivazovska, who's been forcibly displaced from Ukraine. She's a civil society leader there, an advocate for a war crimes tribunal against Vladimir Putin. And finally, we'll have concluding remarks from one of our longtime friends and supporters of the Geneva Summit, Rosa Maria Paya. Where's Rosa? There's Rosa. We'll hear from her. She is a leader of pro-democracy activism. She's the daughter of Oswaldo Paya, who is known as the Nelson Mandela of Cuba, and he was assassinated 10 years ago. So it's quite a significant program. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's traveled very far from California to be with us today. Nazanin Boniadi is an Iranian-born Screen Actors Guild and ACTA Award-nominated actress and renowned human rights activist. Her TV and film credits include How I Met Your Mother, Homeland, Counterpart, and Hotel Mumbai. She will be starring in Amazon's upcoming Lord of the Rings series. Nazanin is an Amnesty International ambassador, has partnered with the U.S. arm of that organization since 2008 to campaign for the rights of disenfranchised populations across the world, with a focus on the unjust conviction and treatment of Iranian youth, women, and prisoners of conscience. She's been published in the Washington Post, CNN, the New York Times. Her advocacy has taken her to the German Bundestag, the British Parliament, and the U.S. Capitol. The Program for Torture Victims awarded Nazanin their 2014 City of Second Chances Award. In 2018, she was selected by People magazine as one of their 25 women changing the world. In 2020, she received the Freedom House Raising Awareness Award, and she was selected for membership by the Council on Foreign Relations. She's a recipient of the 2022 Ellis Island Medal of Honor. Nazanin, please take the floor. It's an honor to have you with us.
The honor's mine. Thank you, Hillel. Deputy Permanent Representative Moini, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to address the United Nations opening of the 14th Annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy. This is an important opportunity to place some of the most pressing human rights situations on the international agenda and to support courageous dissidents and political prisoners around the globe. I want to thank the 25 human rights NGOs that co-sponsor the Geneva Summit for inviting me to speak today on the situation of human rights in Iran, my homeland. I also wish to thank the Permanent Mission of Canada for co-hosting this event. Those of us advocating for human rights in Iran appreciate Canada's support. Canada has been a lead sponsor of a UN General Assembly resolution for the protection and promotion of human rights in Iran since 2003. When dual Iranian-Canadian citizen and freelance photojournalist Zahra Kazemi was killed while in custody, and her medical examiner later testified that she had sustained brutal torture and rape. The support and promotion of such resolutions is the very least the people of Iran expect from the free world. In that regard, we welcome the vote which just took place here on Friday upstairs at the Human Rights Council to renew the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran. Many of the delegates here represent countries that co-sponsored this resolution, and I thank you for that. Because one thing is clear, the people of Iran are being denied their basic human rights. Since the 1979 revolution, the denial of fair trials and due process have been symptoms of the Iranian authorities' disdain for the rule of law and those defending it, as well as tools for the monopolization of power and their persecution of those who challenge it. So sadly, it came as no surprise when security forces yet again unlawfully used lethal force and birdshot to crush mass protests over water shortages in Khuzestan and Lorestan provinces last year, killing at least 11 people and injuring scores more. You may recall that according to Reuters, this number was more than 1,500 in the 2019 protests. Nor should we be surprised that Iran is suffering from an epidemic of torture. Amnesty International has documented that Iranian authorities have failed to provide accountability for at least 72 deaths in custody since January 2010, despite credible reports that they resulted from torture, ill treatment, or the lethal use of firearms and tear gas by officials. Leaked surveillance footage from Tehran's notorious Evin prison in August 2021 showed prison guards beating, sexually harassing, and otherwise torturing prisoners. In the last year, several thousand men, women, and children, including human rights defenders, protesters, bereaved relatives demanding accountability, lawyers, journalists, environmentalists, dissidents, artists, writers, teachers, dual and foreign nationals, have been interrogated and unfairly detained simply for exercising their rights to freedom of expression, association, and assembly. Hundreds remain wrongfully detained by the end of the year. Hundreds of women human rights defenders remain unjustly imprisoned in Iran, including lengthy sentences for at least 6 women who peacefully campaigned against compulsory veiling. In a brave act of civil disobedience, renowned rights defender Narges Mohammadi, who has spent the better part of the last 13 years behind bars for her peaceful advocacy, is resisting a prison summons she received on March 8th. Her latest charges are due to her documentary film opposing solitary confinement, her solidarity with Afghan women being oppressed by the Taliban, and her nomination for a Nobel Peace Prize. She is calling on the international community to give voice to and to platform Iran's civil society leaders. Speaking about women's rights, we cannot understand how the Islamic Republic of Iran was elected to the UN Commission on the Status of Women. If we agree that it's a farce for Russia to sit on the Human Rights Council, How can a regime that subjugates women be elected to the UN body for gender equality and the empowerment of women? And it's not just women. The authorities have banned independent political parties, trade unions, and civil society organizations, censored media, and jammed satellite television channels. In January, the authorities added the messaging application Signal to the list of blocked social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. They've also imposed internet shutdowns during protests, hiding the scale of violations by security forces and preventing people from organizing. The authorities continue to conceal the truth surrounding the January 2020 shooting down of the flight PS752 by the Revolutionary Guards, which killed 176 people. The bereaved relatives of the victims seeking justice in Iran continue to face intimidation, harassment, arbitrary detention, torture, or other ill treatment. And it's imperative that the countries of the victims, including Canada, Ukraine, the UK, Sweden, and Afghanistan, continue to collectively pursue full transparency, accountability, and justice. After a 43-year case study on the Islamic Republic and the rise to the presidency of Ebrahim Raisi, who has been a pillar of the oppressive state, implicated in crimes against humanity, and whose leadership harkens back to 1980s Iran, it's become abundantly clear that a culture of impunity reigns supreme in the country, and the system is impervious to reform. As the logic goes, there's nothing wrong with democracies that can't be fixed with what's right with democracies. Unfortunately, the opposite is true for countries like Iran. The very pillars of the system ensure that its wrongs cannot be made right. We should remember that there is no avenue for justice through domestic channels in Iran, and Iranian victims of serious crimes committed by the Iranian authorities look to the international community to take meaningful action to ensure their rights. This is why Amnesty International and other NGOs have been urging member states of the UN Human Rights Council to support the creation of an impartial mechanism to collect, analyze, consolidate, and preserve evidence of the most serious crimes committed in Iran to facilitate future fair and independent criminal proceedings. For far too long, we have soft-pedaled human rights advocacy in our foreign policy. But human rights are intricately bound with respect for the rule of law, and there can be no good governance in the long run without the rule of law. Good and law-abiding governance not only makes for better regional neighbors, but members of the international community. So it's not just a moral imperative that we prioritize human rights in our foreign policy. It's to our advantage that we don't allow it to overshadow our geopolitical, economic, and other concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazanin. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Zarifa Ghafari. She is Afghanistan's youngest female mayor and survived several assassination attempts. This year, she's been chosen by the 25 human rights groups of the Geneva Summit to receive our International Women's Rights Award, which she'll receive tomorrow. And she's someone who created a women-focused radio station. She was appointed the mayor of Maidan Shar, becoming one of the only female mayors in Afghanistan's history, and the youngest. She had a very difficult time, as you might imagine, serving in that capacity. There were mobs that tried to block her for many months till she could do her job. And when she managed to do the job, she did an incredible job. She faced death threats, survived several assassination attempts, as I mentioned. Tragically, gunmen killed her father in November 2020. In 2019, the BBC listed Zarifa Ghafari among the 100 most inspiring and influential women in the world. It's an honor to have you with us today.
The honor is all mine. Thank you so much. First of all, before going so deep with the discussion or talking about what I'm doing or whatever happening in Afghanistan, I request you all to please stand up for a few seconds and keep silence for the pain that Afghan women are suffering in Afghanistan. Please. Thank you. Thank you so much. Today, I wore all white as a sign of protest. Protest to tell you, women of my country are living dead bodies nowadays. And to ask you to show solidarity by at least sharing, if nothing else, sharing your ideas in your social media platforms, in your country-wise, at least the people who are here, if you people could do that, I'm sure there's like a lot that we can make noise for it in support of women of my country. My name is Zarifa Ghafari, and I'm an Afghan woman. My experience is shared by millions of others in my country. Since birth in my country, I saw women being sold for money. I saw women being stoned, and I saw the body of women of my age burning in the street following a bombing. I saw how the people of my country were being sacrificed to the ambitions of outside powers, from the Soviet Union to Pakistani occupation and to America. We Afghans have endured a level of violence that I'm sure you would not be able to endure for a moment, and yet we still do not lose hope. We continue to fight for our dignity, and we continue to strive for peace. On 26 February 2022, I returned to Afghanistan for the first time since I fled the country last August. My work as a women's rights activist and the mayor of Wardak province mean that my life was in danger when the Taliban retook the country, but I left more because of my family's safety and responsibility toward them. Going back, I took a huge personal risk. In doing so, and have faced fierce criticism from those who accuse me of whitewashing the Taliban regime with my visit. So I will explain how it went for me, what I saw when I was there, and what I ask you, the world's most powerful and influential people, to make life more bearable for Afghans. I wanted to see myself, the situation in my country now that the international community and most of the aid organizations have pulled out. The media has mostly focused on the Taliban and how they will govern. But I am interested in the people. But I believe that we must build rather than serve the bridge between the people of Afghanistan and the world. After the announcement of ban on girls' schooling in Afghanistan, I started working with my aid organization to help Afghan women, which I had it since 2014. Through educational and vocational trainings and maternity health care free services. In the center I have set up in Kabul, I met inspirational young women who are continuing to work as doctors, as teachers in the center. We have always had shocking poverty in Afghanistan, but now even those who were middle class are struggling to survive. State employees have not received their salaries for months. As I drove around Kabul, I saw people standing by the side of the road and selling their household possessions. This was the first impression of situation into my hand and heart. I am under no illusion about the Taliban, but I'm also aware that they will now be in power in Afghanistan for some years to come. That this is a result of the decision taken by America to make a deal with the Taliban and then withdraw all its troops. And yet now, having taken the steps that led to the Taliban retaking power, America and other Western powers are also reluctant to help the ordinary people of Afghanistan to survive. The Taliban government is seen as an illegitimate government, barely recognized by international community. As a result, of financial system in Afghanistan is totally broken. Sanctions have been imposed on the banking system, and the influx of aid money has very quickly dried up. That means that everyday costs are rising to breaking point. Afghans face the double threat of being jobless and facing rising prices. We need to discuss Afghanistan in a logical way. My country has been at war for 40 years. This February, I traveled to a remote village in Wardak province. After billions of dollars and 20 years, 95% of the population in these rural areas still does not have access to adequate food, healthcare facilities, or primary education. As the economic situation has deteriorated further, people are being forced to sell their children and organs to survive. The people of these villages know that most of the money spent by the international community in Afghanistan has simply lined the pocket of the corrupt and powerful people. We are not going to create a democratic, just, and an equal Afghanistan by simply carrying on as we have before. Instead, we must find a way to open a new chapter in the country's story. Achieving peace in a country that has been at war for decades is never easy. Achieving peace in a country that has been for decades in war is never easy. It often involves making distasteful choices and speaking with people you find abhorrent. And yet, there is no other way. That is how peace was achieved in Northern Ireland and Yugoslavia. And I believe it's the only way it can be achieved in Afghanistan. We, the people of Afghanistan and the Taliban, have the responsibility to resolve the differences through dialogue with international community support and observation. Taliban must accept the facts of Afghan society, in particular women's abilities for building up the country. Afghan women have made enough sacrifices. They cannot fight this ongoing humanitarian crisis alone, nor can they withstand the horrors of another civil war in the country. I urge you to do everything you can to take our people out of this predicament and to raise your voices in support of humanity. Women of my country and girls which are not able to go to schools nowadays, the solution is not for all just sitting and sending statements. We need action, at least after 7 months of darkness for men and women of my country. We don't want you to send bus to Afghanistan, but we ask you to not close doors for Afghans that need a safe shelter. Our blood is not different than anyone else in the globe. If you all can stand united against Putin for Ukraine, please stand for Afghanistan against Pakistani proxy war too. And last but not least, we know that the solution must be to confront the reality head on. Therefore, let's put human rights, in particular women's rights, more before any political deal or talk with the Taliban and to the Taliban. This time, you can't win until there is a woman which loves their country and people more than men that you know it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zarifa, and thank you for your courage. You're one of the few people who left Afghanistan, was forced to flee, but then went back recently, so you could give courage and strength to your people. That's quite extraordinary. Our next speaker is Leonid Volkov. He's an extremely busy person for, I would say, primarily 2 reasons. One is he's chief of staff to imprisoned opposition leader in Russia, Alexei Navalny, who, as you know, in February was subjected to a fake trial and sentenced to many more years in behind bars. So he's extremely busy dealing with that issue, and also because he's representing a person and a cause of defying Vladimir Putin. Well, he's very much in the news and interviewed all the time these days, and so we appreciate that you took the time to be with us today, and that you'll be with us tomorrow at our main event at the Geneva CICG. Leonid Volkov is chief of staff to Alexei Navalny, who, as you know, was poisoned and almost died, and nevertheless came back to Russia and then was thrown in prison. For that, Leonid was campaign manager for Mr. Navalny's mayoral campaign in Moscow in 2013, as well as for his bid to get onto the presidential ballot in 2018. Volkov created and led Team Navalny's network of regional offices in 45 of Russia's largest cities. Since 2019, Leonid Volkov operates from abroad, which is not surprising given that the Russian regime is pursuing him with 7 different politically motivated criminal cases. An IT professional by background, Volkov is also the co-founder of the Internet Protection Society, Russia's leading digital rights NGO. Please, you have the floor.
Yeah, now, thank you so much, and my great pleasure and honor to talk here today. I didn't have notes because I wanted first to see the audience to decide what's important to address in this audience. And I want to make a short remark. Last year, Alexei Navalny was awarded by the Geneva Summit Courage Award. And it has been quite a breakthrough because Alexei Navalny, well, the founder of the Anti-Corruption Foundation, is an anti-corruption activist. And for many years, fighting corruption, so doing something like investigative journalism and so on, and fighting for human rights kind of belonged to two different planets. And the last year's Geneva Summit Award was very important because finally it has been recognized internationally that fighting corruption is essentially also a human rights issue. Because, and that's something that we were able to demonstrate over the last 11 years of the Anti-Corruption Foundation works, there is a logic that a corrupt regime has no choice at some point but to start silencing the press. Because they can't afford to get investigated, they have no choice but to remove independent courts because they can't afford to get challenged in courts. They have no choice but to rig the elections because they can't allow to be outvoted. At some point then, after going through all these human rights violations, they feel they have no choice but to start killing their political opponents because otherwise they're too vulnerable. At some point of time, they feel they have no choice but to start a war. And this is unfortunately like a very logical conclusion of Vladimir Putin's 22 years long career in pursuing international corruption. There is a deep connection between the fact that Vladimir Putin is the owner of the largest palace in the world and largest yacht in the world, and the fact that now Russian troops on his order are doing unbelievable atrocities in Ukraine and killing civilians and torturing people and destroying Ukrainian cities. It's his pervert logic, very evil but very rational. He doesn't know any other way to protect his stolen assets. He needs another small victorious war to improve his approval ratings, not to get challenged, not to get ousted, and so on and so on. So we have been talking about this for many years. We have been crying, and unfortunately, probably not loud enough, not convincing enough, because, for instance, we have been calling for sanctions against Putin's oligarchs and his friends and his nominal holders of his assets for many years. And we are quite sure that if these sanctions would be applied preemptively, this could have prevented the war. Unfortunately, what the world has done was too little too late. But still, we believe this lesson has to be learned because, unfortunately, there are many other small Putins and wannabe Putins in the world that follow the same pattern of corruption, then destroying human rights, and then attacking their neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonid. Our next speaker is Berta Valle. She's the wife of imprisoned opposition leader Felix Maradiaga, who was thrown into prison for the crime of running for president, along with several others, and about 170 other individuals who dared to criticize the dictator in Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega. Berta herself is a recognized Nicaraguan activist, journalist, and human rights defender. She has 15 years of experience as a senior television anchor, working with top shows in Nicaragua. She is one of the most recognized broadcasters in the country. In 2016, she was nominated as an independent to represent the city of Managua in the National Assembly by the Independent Liberal Party as part of its National Coalition for Democracy. However, Nicaragua's Supreme Court, controlled by loyalists of the dictator Ortega, disqualified the party's coalition, and Berta was blocked from running. Since 2018, Berta and her daughter and mother-in-law have been living in exile due to persecution faced by her husband Felix and his family. I should note that Felix spoke with us here just a few years ago and is now in prison. He was forcibly disappeared by the regime in June of last year after announcing his intention to run against Ortega in presidential elections, and he remains imprisoned today. Berta is working tirelessly, coordinating defense teams that support Felix inside and outside of Nicaragua. As a consequence of her work, the police and public ministry have found her guilty of being, quote, a traitor to the homeland. The only evidence they presented was so-called investigations into her advocacy on behalf of her imprisoned husband, but it's another way of trying to harass and persecute her. Berta, we're very glad that you're here, and it's particularly personal for us that one of our speakers here a few years ago is now behind bars and suffering the way that Felix is.
Thank you very much. And it's an honor for me to be here. In 2019, my husband Felix Maradiaga was a speaker at the Geneva summit. Today, he is in prison together with more than 175 political prisoners in Nicaragua. In April 2018, in Nicaragua, people took to the streets to peacefully protest Daniel Ortega's autocratic rule. The regime responded with overwhelming violence and killed more than 355 people. Since 2018, the regime's oppression has only increased. There have been silencing the media, criminalizing protest, and persecuted political opponents. In February 2021, Felix announced that he was running for president in the November election against Daniel Ortega. On June, the forces of Ortega's regime illegally detained him and took him away. For 84 days, I had no idea where my husband was. I did not even know if he was alive. The same thing happened to the other 7 presidential candidates, plus journalists, students, peasants, party leaders, and human rights defenders. They're being in jail living in horrific conditions. They sleep in cold concrete slabs without sheets or blankets. They do not have enough food or proper medical attention. They're verbally abused and psychological torture. They do not have access to reading material, not even a Bible. And some remain in solitary confinement. Felix has lost 50 pounds and he is held in total darkness 24/7. This last February, one of the political prisoners died in custody of the police, and we fear others could die in jail too. Along with Victoria Cárdenas, the wife of political prisoner Juan Sebastián Chamorro, I have been speaking out and demanding freedom for all political prisoners in Nicaragua. For our activism for human rights, the regime has condemned us as traitor of the homeland. Because I cannot go back to Nicaragua, I haven't had contact with my husband since his abduction in June 8, and the regime is not allowing us to have any type of contact, not even a phone call, a letter, or even a drawing from our 8-year-old daughter. Recently, Felix and others were sentenced between 8 to 13 years in prison in a trial that had violated all the due process. Last week, the UN Human Rights Council voted to establish a special mechanism for Nicaragua. We are very grateful for the resolution presented by Costa Rica, Chile, Colombia, Canada, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, and Paraguay. This is an important step, and I ask all of you and the international community to continue to support the restoration of human rights and democracy in my country. Thank you.
Thank you, Berta. Our next speaker is Hopewell Shinono, an award-winning Zimbabwean journalist and filmmaker who has worked with the BBC, ITV News, and the New York Times. In 2008, Shinono won CNN's African Journalist of the Year Award. He joined Harvard University as a Nieman Fellow the following year. In 2020, Shinono published an expose alleging corruption in the administration of President Emerson Mnangagwa. His reporting forced the government to fire the health minister, but also resulted in his own arrest on baseless charges. Chinona was released on bail in September 2020, but rearrested in November, accused of contempt of court for exposing further corruption in Zimbabwe's judicial system. In January 2021, last year, Chinona was arrested for the third time in 6 months on charges of, quote, communicating falsehoods that aimed to silence him. The law that was used by police to arrest him was later found to no longer exist. It's an honor that you've come here from Zimbabwe to speak with us. Hopewell, Chinona.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Madam Ambassador and everyone who's here, all protocol observed. I'm a journalist from Zimbabwe and a documentary filmmaker. An accidental activist is not something that I ever thought I would pursue. But because of my work as a journalist, I've found myself in collusion with the state, with the ruling party, with the corrupt politicians in my country. What stirred me to start focusing on these issues, ordinarily I'm a foreign correspondent, and some of the stories that I have been doing since 2018 are not the kind of stories that I would ordinarily do because they are not of interest to the foreign audiences in Europe and America whose organizations I work with. But I focused on these issues because they affected the people around me daily. So for you to get an understanding of how bad things are, right now the whole of Zimbabwe, with 15 million people, does not have a single working radiotherapy cancer machine. So if you get cancer today in Zimbabwe, you've got a death sentence, you are gone. The cost of getting health care outside the country is prohibitive, it's extremely expensive, so only the wealth are able to live, and most of them are surrogates of the ruling elites. In Zimbabwe, 2,500 women die every year giving birth. The biggest hospital in Zimbabwe has got only 2 maternity theaters. They were built in 1977 by the colonial government. Only one of those maternity theaters is working. So it got me to find out why we are so poor and yet the country is extremely wealthy. And if you want to look at the quality of life that a country has, you have to look at how it treats its own citizens, especially the vulnerable. At the time when I started these investigations, Zimbabwe, again with a population of 15 million, only had about 7 psychiatrists. We are in a terrible situation where if you speak, you get arrested and you are thrown into prison. I'm lucky that I'm known internationally. There are many people in Zimbabwe that are rotting in prison that don't have the international profile that I do have, that shouldn't be in prison. In 2020, we found ourselves, like the rest of the world, facing the pandemic, COVID-19. And there was a lot of money that was allocated, some coming from international partners, including Canada, to assist vulnerable countries because they were aware that our health delivery systems were not fit for purpose. And I found myself in a situation where I ended up investigating the looting of public funds meant for COVID-19. And so those investigations, and each time I've investigated, I find myself thrown into prison. So as my good friend Bobby Wine said to me last night when we were having dinner, that it's a great pleasure to come and meet every one of you because it makes you realize that you're not insane. You're not alone fighting dictatorships. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, last night it was said when we, the speakers, were able to meet that many of the dictatorships unite in so many ways and work in concert, and we need to do the same among the countries that support human rights, and we're seeing important action on Russia and Ukraine, and we hope that will translate for other countries as well. In that regard, our next speaker will speak to us about Saudi Arabia. That's an issue that we've always spoken about here at the Geneva Summit for, I'd say, for every year. And a number of years ago, we gave our Courage Award to Raif Badawi, the blogger who his crime was writing a blog calling for a free society, and they threw him in prison, sentenced to lashes and 10 years in prison. And sadly, he spent the 10 years in prison. He was just released, though not yet released from the country, but released from prison. So we welcome Raif's release, and we stand with him and his family. But there are other people that are still in prison. And Arij Al-Sadhan will tell us about that. She's an American citizen now living in California. Her brother, Abdul Rahman Al-Sadhan, is a humanitarian aid worker in Saudi Arabia who was kidnapped from his office at the Red Crescent Society in Riyadh by Saudi authorities during a mass crackdown on critics and human rights activists in 2018. Arij, his sister, has been working tirelessly to demand justice and the release of her brother, and she's come here to Geneva to tell us more about his case. Please.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. And Madam Ambassador, thank you so much for all of you guys being here. So yes, my name is Arij. I'm the sister of a humanitarian aid worker who is currently in prison in solitary confinement. He's been in solitary confinement for a little bit over 4 years. In fact, last year, this day, April 5th, my brother got sentenced to 20 years in prison, followed by 20 years travel ban, simply for tweeting. So my brother in 2018 got kidnapped from his office at the Red Crescent, where he worked as a humanitarian aid worker from Riyadh, and was taken to an unknown location. When he got kidnapped, his phone and his car was taken away without a warrant, and we didn't know about his where he went. He was disappeared for days. We were looking everywhere, calling everyone, until his coworkers found our contact and let us know of what happened. We tried to communicate with the Saudi government to get any information about my brother. They kept denying any knowledge of his kidnap or disappearance. Only after a month, they finally confirmed that they had him. But they continued to refuse to give us any information about his well-being, the reason for his detention, or his location. So he continued to be disappeared, and that went on. Months went by, years, until 2 years of disappearance, he was finally allowed 1-minute call. And that was only after increased international pressure. For the first year, we stayed silent because we were advised that this is the best way and it's dangerous to speak. We stayed silent. We tried every possible way with the Saudi government to get any answers, but we got nothing but refusal and ignoring all our requests. So after a year of that, I realized that there's no hope, and the situation is so dangerous. And that was basically after also we heard about the horrific murder of Jamal Khashoggi. For a long time, we didn't know even if my brother was alive. But I kept my faith and my hope that I'll keep speaking up and I'll keep seeking justice. So after a year, I started to campaign for my brother. I started to campaign to free my brother. And since I wasn't an activist before, I didn't know about the horrific human rights abuses that was going on in the country. So after I started campaigning, I've started to learn about some really horrific human rights abuses. My brother wasn't alone, wasn't the only one. There was a lot, thousands and thousands of people being imprisoned, tortured, disappeared. Their families are being threatened. They're put on travel ban. So we've learned later that my brother was brutally tortured. He was kept in a secret prison. He was tortured with electric shocks, beating, just to name a few. The level of torture have reached where they broke actually his hand and smashed his fingers, saying, "Is this the hand you tweet with?" So, unfortunately, just like the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the level of torture and brutality has no limit in Saudi Arabia today, especially since MBS came to power. So my brother is not the only one. There are thousands like my brother, disappeared and tortured. And just like we've seen with several cases, silence is dangerous. Speaking up is dangerous, but silence is more dangerous. Our silence helps dictators. Our silence makes those in prison suffer a lot more. We need to speak up louder and louder. And we need the UN actually to stand by us and support the Saudi victims, stand by Saudi heroes. They are heroes because they dared to speak up. Inside the country, even behind anonymous accounts, they are heroes. So we need to speak up. We need international organizations to speak up, governments. Our silence will only hurt them. Thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Bobi Wine. He is a Ugandan pop star, activist, and political leader. He heads the National Unity Platform, which is the country's largest opposition party, and he was elected to parliament in 2017. As a singer, Bobi Wine's music has focused on social justice issues. He's been blocked from performing, however, since 2018, his music considered a threat to the political establishment. He received massive support across the country and then started the People Power movement in 2017 to encourage young Ugandans to get involved in politics. Since then, he's been arrested, tortured, subjected to various other forms of abuse and harassment. His supporters and friends have been targeted by the government, with some killed and others abducted and tortured. Bobi Wine was a presidential candidate in Uganda's most recent election, which has been described as the most violent and least fair in the country's history. He was placed under house arrest, denied access to food or water. Now, I see that on social media there's tremendous excitement that you're here at the United Nations and that your followers refer to you as Mr. President. You have the floor.
Mic check, 1, 2, 1, 2. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very honored and privileged to be here, not just for myself, but to highlight the plight of the people of Uganda and many people in the world that face the same that we are facing in Uganda. My name, like you said, is Kyagulanyi Ssentamu, although I'm more popularly known by my stage name as an artist, Bobi Wine. I'm a musician, an activist, and also political leader. And yes, I challenged General Museveni in the 2021 election, which turned out to be the most violent election, not just in the history of Uganda, but in all elections that I've seen, because I had to campaign with a bulletproof vest and a ballistic helmet. I survived 3 assassination attempts in 3 weeks by the police and military. On the campaign trail, my entire campaign team was arrested and incarcerated without charge. Many were tortured, and many are actually still in detention. On November 18th, 2020, I was arrested, and when people protested, the military went on rampage and shot and killed hundreds of protesters, although the regime in Uganda only acknowledged 54. Thousands of our supporters were abducted by unmarked military trucks. Many of them showed up dead on the roadside and in the woods. Many of them returned with severe torture marks and horrifying stories. Women were raped, men were castrated, and others, terrible things are happening to them. Many are still missing up to today. And like I said, many are dead. Many are detained without charge up to today. This did not just happen and stopped in the campaign season. It is still going on as we speak right now. Many political prisoners are held without charge, and this includes 2 members of parliament from my party and a young mother who was taken away and left her breastfeeding baby behind. I could go on and on and on, but it's important for me to highlight that as we speak right now, the mineral-rich region of Karamoja is facing bombardment. Hundreds of extrajudicial killings are ongoing. Houses are being burnt and women are being raped. All that is because that region supported us overwhelmingly and is facing the wrath of the military, which is commanded by the son of General Museveni. I could go on and on and on about the plight of the people of Uganda, but now that I'm here, I want to use this opportunity to request the world for attention. Every time we speak, because we cannot find justice in Uganda by local methods, we tend to highlight our plight to the international community. Although, when we do that, General Museveni brands us as agents of the West and agents of colonialism. But I request the world for attention. If we get just a fraction of the attention that other regions get, we believe that would be a healing process for us, ladies and gentlemen. Just like Putin is doing in Ukraine, just like Putin has been tolerated by the international community, General Museveni has been tolerated for far too long. And the detriment of democracy and human rights is the tolerance of the world's democracies for dictators. Just like Putin had to start a war to win attention and ratings in his country, just last month, Uganda faced a verdict from the International Court of Justice, having raided the Democratic Republic of Congo and plundering and murdering and raping women there. Now the taxpayer of Uganda has to pay more than $200 million to settle that which was caused by General Museveni. Uganda depends largely on international aid, and it's sad that the international community continues to have cooperation and to shake General Museveni's blood-stained hand. We have constantly called for sanctions. We've called for the same standard of human rights in Uganda. We have requested the international community to hold Uganda accountable and to put conditions of human rights, of the respect for human rights and democracy and the rule of law as preconditions for cooperation. And again, we've called for sanctions for General Museveni. And we've said that when Idi Amin did what Museveni is doing in Uganda, he was sanctioned. When Charles Taylor did to the people of Liberia what Museveni is doing right now in Uganda, he was sanctioned. When Robert Mugabe did to the people of Zimbabwe what Museveni is doing to the people of Uganda, he was sanctioned. When Saddam Hussein and many other dictators did what General Museveni is doing in Uganda, they were sanctioned. Why then is General Museveni not being sanctioned? So we are here to challenge the international community to hold General Museveni on the same standard of human rights, of democracy, and the rule of law in Uganda. Dear international community, if you cannot help us, please stop sponsoring our oppression. Please stop being the paymasters of our oppressor. If that stops, then that will be the beginning of the liberation of the people of Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Enes Kanter Freedom. He is a NBA basketball star, a human rights activist, who tomorrow will be receiving our 2022 Courage Award. Enes is a Nobel Peace Prize nominee whose basketball games were banned in China after he dared to speak out about that country's human rights abuses. He was raised in Turkey and was targeted for daring to call out human rights violations by the government of President Erdogan. Turkey canceled his passport, imprisoned his father, and on a 2017 visit to Indonesia, Enes barely escaped police officers sent after him by the Turkish government. Enes Kanter Freedom has become a voice for the oppressed. He recently added the name Freedom officially to his name to demonstrate the passion that he has for this cause. He's become a voice for the oppressed in China and worldwide. In his interviews and via his Freedom shoes that he wears on the basketball court, designed by Chinese dissident artists and other artists, he has spoken out for the rights of the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, and many, many others. 2 months ago, he was traded from the Boston Celtics to the Houston Rockets, then promptly dropped him. Many suspect that the NBA is punishing Enes for daring to speak out against China and that they're trying to silence him. Enes, it means a lot that you took the time to be with us here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. You know, I'm honored and humbled to be here with you guys. You know, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, 72 years ago, a promise was made to us. This promise started with we the peoples of the United Nations. Here I am in front of you, humbled to speak in the names of those that are speechless and censored. Because being silent when you can speak up is a crime. I could just enumerate the names of dictators all over the world that are oppressing their very own people. The same ones that are also abusing those international fora and platforms to pretend they are so benevolent and respectful to their human rights obligations. Yet a 3-minute speech will sadly not be enough time. That is why I prefer to focus on the peoples, on the victims, because they are like you and I, the peoples of the United Nations. They are threatening us. They are trying to break us. They are trying to defeat us. And most of all, they're trying to break our unity and solidarity. In other words, they want to divide us. This is why I speak up today, and I look at them in the eye, and I say, try and try again, here we are. Cuban, American, Saudis, Tibetan, Iranians, Ukrainian, Russian, Venezuelan, Chinese, North Korean, Zimbabwean, Uyghur, Belarusian, Vietnamese, Nicaraguan, Afghan, Turkish, as well as Gülen movement and Kurdish people, Muslims, Shias, Sunnis, Jewish, Christian, atheists, women, and men, younger and older. We gather and we speak up all together, united, one and unique voice, and we say no to arbitrary detention, no to enforced disappearances, no to torture, no to censorship, no to corruption. And we say yes to freedom of speech, to democracy, and to rule of law. And we won't be silent until our people will be free from oppression and violence. Today, I stand in this room in the United Nations. I am no United Nations expert. I am no lawyer, no diplomat, nor politician. I'm an athlete, but I firmly intend to remind to all United Nations members to promise to their people to prevent wars, to promote and protect freedoms and human rights. And I also remember this friend who was explaining to me that the purpose of the United Nations. She quoted the second Secretary General of the United Nations, who said the United Nations was not created in order to bring us to heaven, but in order to save us from hell. These words remain as valid today as they were 60 years ago. Yet I would like to make these words mine and say that if the United Nations cannot bring heaven to the people, let's work together to ensure to make lives of those oppressors and dictators hell and to bring them in front of courts. Thank you.
Thank you, Enes. You are a world-famous basketball star who decided to sacrifice your career for the cause of the Uyghurs, the people of China, and for human rights in general. And the whole world saw that. And there's very few people who sacrifice a professional athletic career to do what you're doing. So you give us tremendous courage, and you've shown tremendous courage, and we're really honored that you'll be receiving our award tomorrow. Thank you. Our next speaker comes to us from Ukraine, which the whole world has been watching with horror in the past few days and the past several weeks. Olga Ivazovska is chair of the Ukrainian civil society organization Opora, head of the board at the Global Network of Domestic Election Monitors. She is currently displaced from Ukraine in Poland, where she works at the International Center of Ukrainian Victory. Forced to flee Ukraine after the recent Russian invasion, she has become one of the chief advocates for a special tribunal against Vladimir Putin and his associates. She's leading a program to document war crimes by the Russian military by speaking with refugees in Poland. Prior to Putin's invasion, she participated in negotiations with Russia to end the conflict in the Donbass. She was named repeatedly one of the top 100 most influential women in Ukraine. She comments regularly on Ukrainian politics, electoral reform, and the advancement of democracy. I know you're going through terrible things in your life and the life of your people right now, and it means a lot that you made the trip to be with us here at the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I'm going to have a long speech tomorrow. That's why I have only 3 minutes today. And I want to focus on my feelings. I have only one wish: to back home. I'm 40 years old. I had a professional background. I was fighting for free and fair elections, not only in Ukraine, but around the world, because my organization has capacity to share the best practices, how to protect political rights in Ukraine. Ukraine was a part of post-Soviet Union and world for many, many years. But when Ukraine decided to be democratic countries and to stay strongly on that point of decision-making process, Russia decided to break the state, to kill the civilian and to continue this aggression as far as it possible. You know that Russians had a hope that Ukraine will be occupied during 48 hours. I have only one superpower. I'm Ukrainian. And my son, he is sitting here. He wants to back home. We are talking about that each day. 5 Ukrainian children have been killed each of the day. 60% of Ukrainian children are displaced already. 4 million Ukrainians are living now abroad, and 80% of these people want to back home. And doesn't matter what countries will open the doors for our citizens, all of these people want back home. My husband is fighting for Ukrainian independence already, as many of my colleagues, because our men have to protect our state and our society. But if you think that the worst thing what may happen with your cities or your country is missiles or bombing the peaceful cities and state, it doesn't true. Did you see what is going on in Bucha or Irpin? In de-occupied cities, small cities near the Kiev. After liberated small towns like Irpin and Bucha, it's impossible to ignore what's really going on. Hundreds of people were executed. And truly, we don't know the real number of people which were killed by Russian soldiers during a few weeks on these cities. Shot in back of their head, with their hands tied behind their backs. They were murdered with their children. They have been lying in the streets for weeks. You can easily find the photos in global media. This is anti-human behavior. Along the roads and sidewalks lay the naked bodies of women who were raped. In Bucha town, civilians were executed. But we are talking about 35,000 city, small city. Can you imagine what is going on in Mariupol now? It's 400,000 city with civilians which couldn't leave the city because it's almost blocked by Russians. And the worst story that it's not only Putin. It's 71% of the Russians which are supporting his decision to destroy Ukrainian state. You are a part of the history because democratic state now is under the attack of authoritarian regime with Belarus. Not only Russia participated on this war. And Ukraine can be a corridor between free world as EU and other countries and between authoritarian states. 86% of the Russians will be happy if Russia will start aggression against EU. Of course, you can't believe in each of these statisticians because so many people can say truth in Russia. At the same time, we see that it's not only Putin regime. Historically, Soviet Union didn't got their responsibility after the thousands of hundreds of Ukrainians which were killed for many tenths of the years on this part of the world. That's why I believe that in the evil of the left if the evil is left unpunished, it will only keep growing. Please stop this aggression and not just continue watching what is going on in Ukraine. Please support Ukraine because it's a new page of the history after the Second World War. Other authoritarian regimes will see that nothing will happen with them if they decide to destroy not only the political will of their state or their people and their civilians, but any other, in any other part of the world. Thank you. Sorry for emotion.
Thank you, Olga. And You have tremendous courage that you came here, and it's very important for the international community to hear your testimony, and I hope that everyone here will take what you said and do whatever we can, whether it's human rights groups or member states, to help your people and to stop this aggression. Our final speaker, who will be delivering the concluding remarks of the 14th Geneva Summit United Nations opening, is Rosa Maria Paya. She's been a longtime friend of the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and spoken numerous times before. She is a Cuban pro-democracy activist, civil society campaigner, I would say one of the most well-known representatives of her people who are trying to free her people. She works to promote international solidarity with Cuba, seeks justice for her father, Oswaldo Paya, who received the European Parliament's prestigious Sakharov Prize, was a 5-time Nobel Peace Prize nominee who was assassinated 10 years ago, and we've never had justice for the case of her father. She coordinates Cuba Decide, advocates for the Cuban government to hold a binding referendum for free and fair elections. She's president of the Latin American Network of Young People for Democracy. Rosa has appeared before the United Nations Human Rights Council upstairs, speaking often for UN Watch. She's been interrupted numerous times by the Cuban government and their allies, but she persists. She's spoken at the European Parliament, the US Senate, Organization of American States, Summit of the Americas, and many national parliaments. In 2019, Rosa Maria Paya received UN Watch's Morris Abram Award for her courageous defense of freedom, liberal democracy, and universal human rights. I would say that her mission to free the Cuban people from dictatorship has never been more vital. Rosa Maria.
Thank you so much, Hillel. It's, as always, an honor to be here with you and with so many human rights defenders, so needed voices in the face of the evil. As you mentioned, next July 22nd will mark 10 years since my father, Oswaldo Paya, prominent Cuban opposition leader, was assassinated by the Cuban communist regime. In 2013, Ban Ki-moon, the UN General Secretary at that time, received and circulated a petition to create an international committee in order to conduct an independent investigation into the killing of my father. That investigation is yet to be conducted. In contrast, the Cuban regime sits in the Human Rights Council, from where they protect their impunity, making sure that the multiple accusations against them or against the rest of their criminal friends, I mean Venezuela, China, Russia, Iran, etc., do not prosper. All of these regimes act in gangs, conspiring together to cover their backs and empty the mission of the Human Rights Council of content and effectiveness. So we can only hope that the soon-to-be the expulsion of Russia from the Human Rights Council be followed by the expulsion of Cuba and the rest of the currently seated dictatorships upstairs. We all know the long criminal friendship history between the Castro brothers and Russia. We all remember the role that the Cuban regime played during the Cold War. For some decades, the world thought that these ties were no longer a threat. However, now we are seeing the deepening of the military and strategic agreement signed by Cuba's and Russia's regime. In last December 2021, Russia threatened a repeat of the Cuban Missile Crisis. On January 13, 2022, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov repeated the threat, telling in Russian TV, and I'm quoting, that he could neither confirm nor exclude sending military assets to Cuba. On February 2022, just days before Russia's invasion, the Speaker of the Russian Congress arrived in Cuba and thanked Cuba for supporting Russia's decision on Donetsk and Luhansk. After, Russia forgave for 5 years the $2.2 billion debt that the Cuban regime has with Russia. Actually, the Americas has paid a high price for tolerating a communist dictatorship in Cuba. It has caused the end of the democracy in Nicaragua and Venezuela, and caused the largest refugee crisis in our region. The regime threatens peace and security of the continent and is systematically provoking migratory crisis. It is involved in the Russian zoning attacks against American diplomats, initially called the Havana Syndrome, and in many other sorts of criminal-related activities, from trafficking persons to providing sanctuary and support to terrorists. The Cuban regime is the Berlin Wall of our time. But to turn it down, the Cuban people need the support of the international community. For 63 years, Cuba has been held hostage of an oppressive dictatorship that denies in law and in practice the most basic human rights of its own people. After more than 6 decades without free, fair, or multi-party elections in Cuba, Cuba is in crisis. According to the Hanke Misery Index of 2021, Cuba is the most miserable country in the world, driven by a soaring inflation rate, shortages of basic products, and tens of thousands of people have abandoned the country in the last 5 months. But in the chamber upstairs, they say that Cuba is some beacon for social justice where everybody is equal, when the truth is that the Cuban military elite have sat fat while the Cuban people starves. While the truth is that that commercial tourist paradise is a prison for the Cuban people. But the Cuban people have said enough. And last July, hundreds of thousands of Cubans took to the streets in peaceful nationwide protests, chanting freedom, down with the dictatorship, change of system, patria y vida, which is motherland and life, and is the opposite of what the communist regime propagate, which is motherland or dead. The popular demand for a democratic opening is clear, as it is the only way to ensure respect for human rights and the rule of law. But the regime response included calling for a civil war to defend the revolution, brutal arrests, torture, sham trials, and sentences for up to 30 years. Currently, the regime holds more than 1,000 political prisoners, mostly peaceful protesters, many under the age of 18, children as young as 16 and 17 years old being condemned up to 18 years in prison. Our movement, Cuba Decide, is a national and global initiative to force the Cuban regime to submit to the will of the people and leave. This can only be achieved by citizen mobilization and international pressure, and that is what we work for. But activists on the island fight in the most disadvantageous conditions possible. And it is imperative that all of the nations of the free world support the Cuban people's fight for a change, because the victory of the democracy in Cuba is essential to open the path to peace, prosperity, and stability in the whole hemisphere. It seems that the world has been sleeping while the Chinese Communist Party tries to exterminate Uyghurs. The Taliban regime takes over Afghanistan. The Putin and Iranian regime kills dissidents, and Venezuelan and Nicaraguan dictatorship torture political prisoners following the Cuban State Security's handbook. In the face of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the world is maybe awakening, maybe, to the great threat behind the illusion of peace and stability that Western democracies have lived in the past half a century. The great Edmund Burke alerted us. He said that the only sin necessary for the triumph of evil is for the good men to do nothing. I believe that in the aftermath of the Bucha genocide, we should all understand, and especially the Western democracies, and especially the democratic nations united in this house, we should all understand that when in the face of evil you do nothing, you cannot be longer considered a good man. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosa, for your powerful concluding remarks. And indeed, I want to thank all the speakers for their very powerful testimonies about human rights abuses suffered by their family members, by their people. And I know that member states here appreciate the opportunity to be informed and inspired for their own work here at the United Nations. Before we conclude, I do once again, I want to thank the Permanent Mission of Canada to the United Nations for co-sponsoring today's United Nations opening event. And I would like to invite the family members and representatives of political prisoners, if you could please gather there with the photos of your family members and people that you represent, and we'll take a photo. And with that, we will conclude.
Yeah. Okay, Dylan, can we do one without the names? And can you go a bit closer, please? Put the chairs a bit back and get closer. Yeah, just go closer together, everyone. Perfect. Perfect. Okay, I'm just going to wait for the other photographer to move out of the way in a second. Great, there we go. This is a good idea. Okay. Thank you.